Hello, you're listening to the Science of Everything podcast, episode 30, Systems of Government. In this episode, I'm going to look at the different systems of government that are used in various countries, either throughout history or currently in the world, and discuss the various sources of power and means of exercising that power. The type of systems I'll look at include the various types of democracies, oligarchies, dictatorships, monarchies, autocracies, and so on. This is my first episode on political science, and I thought that this would be a good one to start off with because it sort of sets a basis for the different basic types of governments that exist, and governments are obviously a very important topic in political science, so it seems a good thing to start off with. So first of all, before I get into the classifications of different sources of governmental power, we need to look at what is a government, or what makes up government. Now this is a controversial and complicated topic, but basically for the purposes of this episode, we can consider government to be a body of people and associated organizations that control a state. Now, a state is also a controversial subject, so for our purposes, we'll take a simplification that a state is basically a country, be it small or large. So Russia is a state, Zimbabwe is a state, USA is a state, and so on. So a government is the body of people and the associated organizations that control a given state or country. A government makes laws, interprets laws, enforces the laws, maintains order, sets policies, arbitrates internal conflicts, and does that sort of thing. So a government includes, the Prime Minister or the President or the monarch or the dictator or whoever, the Parliament if there is one, the ruling party, and also things like the military, the police, court system, civil servants. All of that is part of the government. So it refers both to particular people and also to a sort of a generic concept of an institutional structure. There's one other important distinction to make between a government and the government. A particular government refers to a particular set of people and perhaps a party that is governing a state, country, at a particular time. So you might have governments are sometimes named after people, like Hitler's government in Nazi Germany, or Bush's government in the USA, for example, or they might be named after the political parties, so the socialist government, or the left-wing government, or something like that, the communist government. That is a particular structure and group of people that are with a set of policies and ideals and whatever that are governing a country at a particular time. The government is a broader concept which refers to the institutions of government as a whole, regardless of who in particular or what individuals or parties are exercising those powers and inhabiting those institutions at that particular time. So, for example, the government of the US stays the same regardless of who is president or what party controls Congress and so on. There is a federal government as a whole, which then is sort of controlled or taken over periodically, in a sense, or taken control of by a given political party or individual president, which is then referred to as a particular government. Another example might be, maybe you talk about the government of China, which was originally an imperial government, then there was a revolution, and then you had Republican government, and then later on there was a civil war, and you had a communist government. So those were particular governments, be it imperial, Republican, or communist, but throughout the whole period, well, more or less, you had a concept of the Chinese government, the overall federal structure that was governing the area we roughly call China, and the associated institutions and structures and so on. So there is a distinction between those two. So in this episode, we're really talking about the government as a whole, not a particular government. We're talking about broad conceptions of different ways of governing countries, not particular policies or the individual choices of this president or that political party or something like that. Okay, so having defined government, we'll now have a quick word on classification and how we're going to deal with that, because obviously classifying political systems or social systems or economic systems is difficult because there's a lot of overlap and imprecision and so on. So each government is unique in many aspects, but there are also certain common features and attributes which we can use to group states into rough, fuzzy, overlapping classes, but still useful categorizations. There are many different ways to do this, so there's no one right way of classifying governments or political systems. There are different ways which may be more or less useful for a given purpose or a given context. So some of these different classification systems could include the de jure political status or the de facto political practice of the nation. De jure means by law, like what's written down in the constitution or whatever. De facto means what actually happens. So de jure, you could be a democracy, but de facto, you could be a dictatorship, for example. You could classify nations by either of those two situations. You could also classify them by the degree of democratic freedom or the degree of centralization of political power versus decentralization to local governments, the size of the state or the government, degree of repression, and so on. In this episode, though, we're going to focus on the type and extent of political power. So that's sort of who holds the power, how the power is exercised, the power of government, and the degree to which the government exercises power or intervention in the state or society as a whole. This is perhaps the most basic way of categorizing governments. In later episodes, we'll look at, say, degree of democratic freedom or centralization of political power and the issue of federalism, which are sort of more specialized issues. This is the most broad classification of governments, just by type and extent of power, basically. Okay, so let's get on to the actual classification. There are 5 broad classification categories that I've put into this episode. There are different ways you could do it. Once again, this is not the single right way. These are anarchy, democracy, oligarchy, monarchy, and autocracy. And within each of those, there's a number of subcategories, which can be rather different from each other. But in each of those 5 broad categories, there are overall similarities. Oh, just a note on terminology. Basically, archy or crassy, that suffix there is derives from the Greek, which basically means like rule or power or something like that. The word itself refers each of the category titles gives you a clue as to what type of power it is or how it's exercised. So anarchy, anarchy, which is basically a meaning the absence or lack of. So anarchy is the absence of power or the absence of control, and means essentially lack of government. You might think that anarchy is anarchy. There's no real distinction there, but there are actually different forms of anarchy, or at least forms of lack of government that I've categorized, which I'll talk about. Those are relatively rare in history because they tend to be unstable and replaced by some more centralized government. Next one is democracy. This is demo, referring to the people, and crassy, sort of rule, power. So rule by the people, basically, is what democracy means. And there are a couple of types of that. That's historically been rather rare, but obviously much more common in, say, the 19th, 20th centuries. Most nations nowadays are de jure, that is by law, democracies, but in practice the degree of actual democratic engagement and freedom of speech and so on differs. Next one is oligarchy. So oli meaning a few or a small number, and garchy power. So this oligarchy basically means rule by the few. Not by the one, but by the few. So oligarchy is sort of halfway in between democracy and monarchy, which I'll talk about in a second. Democracy is ruled by many, or ruled by the people. Monarchy or dictatorship is ruled by one. Oligarchy is ruled by a few people, so it can include where there's a single ruling party in power or when a small elite governs and so on. But we'll go through those different categories. There are many different types of oligarchy. The next category that I've already alluded to is monarchy. Mon or mono meaning one, and archy, rule, power. So basically rule by the one is what monarchy means, or rule by a single person. That it has been the most common method of rule or form of government throughout history. Relatively rare nowadays though. The final category that I have is autocracy, which also sort of meaning self, and grassy rule, so basically rule by self or self-power, rule derived from, it's a little bit hard to exactly get the sense of this one. Monarchy is often classified as a type of autocracy, but I've separated them out because I think there's enough of a distinction there to warrant a distinction. Autocracy is basically the other forms of single-person rule that are not monarchies. So they include things like military rule and dictatorships and so on, authoritarian and totalitarian states, which I'll talk about. So that's the 5 broad categories in order of basically going from less central control to more central control: anarchy, democracy, oligarchy, monarchy, and autocracy, just to give you a broad overview. Alright, so starting back at anarchy, I'm going to go through the subcategories and give some examples of states that fit into these specific categories and talk about some of their attributes. So first of all, autocracy. I may pronounce that wrong. It's spelled O-C-H-L-O, crassy. This is rule by the mob. Broad government structure. It's an important sort of category or concept to know about. So an autocracy could be an actual rule by a mob, or intimidation of legitimate authorities by a mob. Generally associated with herd behavior, irrationality, madness of crowds, that sort of thing. It's a problematic form of government because it's highly unstable and often gives rise to autocracies or other less savoury forms of government. It's also at the risk of tyrannies of the majority, poor decision-making, hasty decision-making, oppression of minority groups, retributive justice, like lynchings and that sort of thing. Once again, seldom that a state for any significant period of time is governed by an autocracy, but it is an important concept because we can use it to understand situations like black lynchings, for example, in the southern US. I mean, lynchings happen in many places, but this is just an example that people are familiar with in the southern US, say 19th, early 20th century. Salem witch trial back in 17th century, or witch trials in many places in Europe around the same time as well, would be another example. Many peasant and worker revolts throughout history, especially in places like China or throughout medieval Europe, perhaps slave revolts as well. But especially peasant and worker revolts in the 19th century Europe would be another example. Could also be categorized as ruled by the mob. Once again, often not for very long, but the mob can be a catalyst towards, say, a revolution or a change in power or something like that. So that's not exactly a form of government, because it's really the least organized, the most chaotic form of governments, or a governments that there is. But it's important to know. So next subcategory I'm going to talk about is isocracy, which iso meaning equal, so sort of equal rule or equal power is what isocracy means. Rule by equals. This is where all citizens have equal political power. I don't really know of any examples of this, nor do I really can say how it would work in practice. I just included for completeness. Now I'm going to talk about the third subcategory, libertarian socialism. So this sounds like socialism, which is I've actually put in the autocracy category, or can sometimes be in the democracy category, depending on what type of socialism it is. By the way, don't worry too much about what socialism is if you don't know what it is, because we'll probably have a whole episode on socialism and communism, because that's a very important topic. But socialism is basically concerned with equality of various sorts, political and economic. But anyway, libertarian socialism is not the same thing as socialism, so don't get too confused. Libertarian socialism is basically a form of anarchism. It's non-hierarchical, non-bureaucratic, stateless society without private property. So generally the governments in a libertarian socialist country or state occurs through decentralized direct democracy, so people voting directly on sort of councils, things like citizens' assemblies, through trade unions, workers' councils, that sort of thing. So this is not the same as autocracy. It's not like absence of rule or total mob rule or something like that. There are institutions, but they're localized and decentralized and voluntary. So as I said, it's things like citizens' assemblies or trade unions or a local council or something like that. And people voluntarily turn up and directly engage with that sort of rule. So these sort of countries tend to be unstable. None have lasted for very long, but there are some examples in history. So the Israeli kibbutz, for example, I think there are a few of those around today, but they are more popular around the 60s and 70s. Basically small socialist communities that existed in Israel, a few hundred people, generally agricultural communities, once again that were voluntary and had decentralized direct democratic decision-making and so on. The Paris Commune that existed in 1870 for a couple of months in Paris was sort of like a revolutionary state that was run by workers' councils and trade unions and so on. Didn't last for very long. There are a couple of other examples as well. The Free Territory in the Ukraine that existed in the early 1920s, I think around the time of the Russian Revolution, before it was invaded by, I'm not exactly sure who invaded, probably the Soviet Union. That was once again a significant area of the Ukraine which was governed by citizens' assemblies or farmers' associations, workers' councils and that sort of thing, with no real central government. And Revolutionary Catalonia, which was a section of Spain that existed for a couple of years during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, which once again was run along libertarian socialist lines with decentralized, local, direct democratic rule and absence of private property. Most of those don't last for very long, and neither did any of these states, the Free Territory, Paris Commune, or Revolution Catalonia, last for very long, because they tend to be invaded by an external power, basically, and they tend to arise in sort of revolutionary, unstable circumstances. Okay, so that's libertarian socialism, and the final case of anarchy that I want to talk about is anarcho-capitalism. So anarcho-capitalism is sort of associated with libertarian socialism because they're both forms of anarchism, like political philosophies. There's no political philosophy associated with autocracy or rule by the mob. That's the total absence of any rule. But libertarian socialism and anarcho-capitalism both have ideologies or political schools of thought associated with them. But anarcho-capitalism disagrees with libertarian socialism basically on the role of private property. So anarcho-capitalist states are sort of direct democratic in some sense, individual sovereignty, decentralized, like libertarian socialism, but the one big difference is that they have private property. In fact, the general idea of anarcho-capitalism is that everything, including state, law enforcement, courts, money, roads, it's like everything you would normally associate with the state is actually provided through private contract and monetary transactions. So, I mean, the big risk of this sort of state is how long a society would be able to last before some powerful individual or company or family or something like that establish their own government through force. So if you have competing law enforcement agencies contracting with individuals or principalities or like local areas or whatever to provide law enforcement or legal judicial facilities and so on, as prisons and so on, as anarcho-capitalists will argue, that may work, but the question is how long will it work before one of them becomes more powerful than the others and just decides to take over through force. So perhaps because of this sort of risk of a de facto state, perhaps a monarchy or something, being set up in the stead of an anarcho-capitalist society, this sort of government is really rare throughout history. It hasn't really ever existed in its proper form. But there have been a couple of societies or areas which have been argued to have exhibited many characteristics of anarcho-capitalism. The two common examples are medieval Iceland around the 11th, 12th centuries, where law, judicial services, also many things like land and so on, were traded with money and through voluntary transactions and so on. So it was very commercial in that sense. but still voluntary without this overarching government to impose any of its laws on people. So that was considered to be a sort of a proto-anarcho-capitalist regime or society by some people. Another example that's sometimes given is the American Old West around the 19th century, where once again there was a large absence of central authority, and justice, law, and currency and so on and any other goods and services too were provided on a voluntary basis by monetary transactions between individuals or groups and so on. Okay, so that's anarchy. So just to recap the different classes: autocracy, rule by mob; isocracy, theoretical rule by equals; then you've got libertarian socialism and anarcho-capitalism. All of those forms of anarchy are quite rare and generally don't turn up too much, but need to be understood because they are important classes of states and something that people sometimes reference. Okay, moving on to the next category now, democracy. Now there are two basic types of democracy: direct democracy and representative democracy, or also called a republic. Direct democracy is when people vote directly on policy initiatives and they are involved directly with decision making. Sometimes they also sit directly on courts or act directly as judges. So instead of having a judge or jury, a direct democracy might have a very large group of people, group of citizens deciding the case directly. This is what happened in ancient Greece, for example. So you might have in a direct democracy, you have a large group of people, or perhaps everyone being able to cast a vote for passing executive decisions, making laws, or electing or dismissing officials, conducting trials, and that sort of thing. It's very difficult to apply direct democracy. I don't know if there are any examples of this, to apply it in a large heterogeneous state like the US or China or India, for example, because it's just too hard to manage logistically, and the more people you have, it's harder to make decisions, get all the votes in, and so on. And the more heterogeneous you are, the more the state is, the more disagreements and problems you tend to have, which can lead to inability to make effective and rapid decisions. But direct democracy has and is applied successfully in relatively small states. So, for example, ancient Athens had a direct democracy. So remember, most states nowadays are republics or representative democracies. People often associate democracy with Athens or ancient Greece, because Athens wasn't the only democratic city-state in Greece, but it's the canonical example. People often associate Athens with democracy, but the democracy that they had was direct democracy, which is very different to representative or republican democracy, which is what most states in the world now have. So that is an important distinction to draw. So some other examples of direct democracy include Switzerland. Not so much on the national level, but especially at local level. Switzerland is very decentralized, and their political system differs between the different cantons, which are sort of like states, and local councils and so on. There's a lot of complexity there. If you want to read more into it, which we don't have time to get into in this episode, but there is a large element and large degree of direct democracy in Switzerland. And also some states and counties in the United States have a large element of direct democracy. For example, in California, they're often voting, there's a plebiscite, popular vote on a particular law or proposal that's put forward. That is an example of direct democracy. So once again, direct democracy is often something that is not completely adhered to in the pure sense, but elements of it are present to a greater or less degree in various states. But once again, it does tend to be rare because it's hard to apply in larger states. So the second form of democracy, which I've been mentioning, is representative democracy or a republic. So in this, the people do not directly vote on things or do not directly appoint individuals or do not directly conduct trials. The only thing they do is basically vote on the government or vote on their representatives, and perhaps they might discuss political issues in the media and so on, or they may lobby and talk to their representatives, but they do not govern directly themselves. So government itself is directed by the people through their chosen representatives, or at least a significant portion of the people. There are many examples of republican government. So many classical Greek city-states also had this form of government. The Roman Republic was had elements of direct democracy, but was also it was called a republic in the sense that it had elected representative officials. Renaissance Italian city-states in, say, the 15th, 16th centuries, that sort of period, many of those were republics. Hanseatic League, basically those were sort of Scandinavian, northern German city-states, similar to the Italian city-states. The Dutch Republic in around 17th, 18th centuries was a representative government. The United States of America and most other modern democratic states are republics in the sense that they're representative democracies. And there are many subtypes of representative democracies: parliamentary, presidential, semi-presidential, and some other hybrid mixed systems. But that is there's a whole sort of subfield of research which involves comparing parliamentary to presidential systems. So parliamentary systems, kind of like what they have in Britain and many other European countries, where you have a parliament and a prime minister. presidential system is what they have in the US and many other Latin American countries, where you don't have a prime minister, but you have a president, and then a parliament which is sort of separate from the president. But I won't go into the details of those now because, as I said, there's a whole lot of theory and research related to that. But they are both subtypes of a republic, a representative democracy, which are both distinct from the direct democracy. And republics have been relatively rare throughout history until around the 19th century. Mostly before then, they were just, as you might have seen from my examples, relatively small city-states or small republics, because then any larger areas tended to be too hard to aggregate to aggregate, say, votes and things like that together to form a stable representative system before the development of more modern technologies which have permitted mass representative states. And now the republic is the most common political system in the world. Okay, so that's all the democracies covered. Now we're going to move on to oligarchies, which is ruled by the few, or a small elite, but that elite can be different between different countries. There are many types of oligarchies, and they're quite common throughout history and still relatively common today. First one I want to talk about is aristocracy, or plutarchy. Now, aristocracy technically means rule by the best or rule by the excellent, but and plutarchy technically means rule by the rich, but generally they're more or less the same thing. So an aristocracy is often an elite, upper class, wealthy, landed gentry or something like that. Plutarchy, just rich people. They could be businessmen or landowners or whoever. So I'm grouping these together. Aristocracy and plutarchy is basically the same thing. It's ruled by a small number of elite, wealthy individuals. So aristocracies and plutarchies can be stable, but they can also suffer from internal power struggles between the wealthy individuals, which can eventually lead to them becoming monarchies or autocracies, depending on how it goes. Or sometimes sometimes an aristocracy can be sort of a stepping stone onto becoming a more democratic state, which is kind of what happened in a lot of European states. They start off as more centralized, or were at least centralized at one period in time, and then became more of an aristocracy, plutarchy, and then eventually became a democracy as the power became spread across more and more of the population. So there are many examples of aristocracies. Many ancient and medieval city-states and republics were in practice aristocracies. That is, by law perhaps, or technically everyone had a vote, or every citizen had a vote, but in practice, Roman Republic is a good example of this. In practice, a small wealthy elite really controlled things. Medieval feudal states, and also the Tokugawa shogunate and the Zhou dynasty in China, which was around the middle of the first millennium BC, so quite a while ago. Tokugawa shogunate is like 16th century Japan, around then 17th century. 18th century England as well was a plutarchy aristocracy with rule by a small elite of the aristocracy and so on, as the power was moving away from the king towards England becoming more democratic in the, say, 19th century. But going back to the medieval feudal states, so most of the feudal states you think of in medieval Europe, England, France, Spain, Germany, those sort of places, where you had the knights and the lords above them and the barons and then the king and the peasants below them all and so on. This is an example of aristocracy, because although they had most of them had kings by law, in practice most power was decentralized to a small elite of landed gentry, who were the nobles and the knights and so on. So that was very common in medieval Europe, but as I said, it also existed in Japan during the Tokugawa period, in China, in the Zhou dynasty, in some other periods as well, and it's existed in various other states throughout history which have been more or less feudal. Okay, so then that's an aristocracy or a plutarchy. The next one I want to talk about is a technocracy, which is my personal favorite of all the political systems. Technocracy meaning ruled by experts. Now, this is where decision makers are selected based upon how knowledgeable and skillful they are in their particular technical field, or their field of expertise, to be effective decision makers and policy makers and so on. In practice, it'll be the government or state is ruled by scientists, engineers, economists, maybe some judges and legal issues and so on. So people who are experts in their particular fields. This form of government is relatively rare in history. It's never existed in its pure form. Basically, you have governments you don't have any government that has been manifestly technocratic. I don't think any government has self-described itself as technocratic, largely because these sort of states face severe legitimacy problems. Because these experts tend not to be, they're obviously not democratic, so they can't appeal to legitimacy there. But they also can't appeal to legitimacy based on divine right, or based simply on brute force or wealth of the people ruling, as an aristocracy or a monarchy or even a military state can. The experts are not military leaders or people who have the most money in most cases. So that's perhaps why these sort of states tend to be rare. It's that there's very little prospect for them coming about unless some existing state decides to become technocratic in the way they govern. And that's generally why you have some states that lean towards technocratic but are not pure technocratic. So technocracy was influential in the West during the Great Depression because it was perceived that the more perhaps populist or the more representative form of democracy, the traditional form, had failed, and there was more need for intervention by experts. Also, Chile in the early 1970s under Allende, who was nominally a socialist, but his socialist regime was particularly technocratic in the way they went about things, or sort of began to go about things. They even had a control center that they set up. I don't think it was ever used because they were kicked out of power quite early, but where you had like a whole bunch of computer systems hooked up to receiving information from factories and other industries all over the country, and with the swivel chairs for easy decision making and planning and so on. Sort of very sci-fi looking. So that's probably perhaps the best example of a technocratic government, Allende's Chile. Other socialist governments throughout the 20th century have also been more or less technocratic in the way that they talk about, central planning and experts making decisions and so on. The modern Chinese government, the Communist government in China, is also sometimes referred to as technocratic because many of the top people have engineering or science backgrounds, and there's an emphasis in the state on carefully planning of overall economic and infrastructure objectives and pursuing science and that sort of thing. Technocracy doesn't have to be socialist oriented, though. There are other examples might include where Western economic experts and especially economists, but other experts as well, were hired to restructure the Soviet states, say Russia and Poland and so on, after communism collapsed and they were reforming. So those sort of early transitional governments could be more or less described as technocratic, perhaps. All right, so that's technocracy. Next is critarchy, ruled by judges. This is quite sort of an obscure form of government, but it's an interesting one to consider. This is when a relatively small number of judicial experts or judges governs according to pre-existing laws. So the key aspect of a critarchy is that they don't generally make new law. They interpret old law and govern according to pre-existing customary law. Sometimes statutory law, so sometimes it's written down, but often it's customary. So the two examples of this I'm most familiar with are the rule of judges in ancient Israel. So you've got the book of Judges in the Bible. That was during the period when Israel was run by a bunch of judges, legal experts who applied existing law. Another example is the Islamic Courts Union in modern Somalia, particularly around, I think, 2006, a couple of years back. The Islamic Courts Union had a lot of power. They controlled a fair bit of Somalia. I don't think they're as powerful anymore, but basically they run their area, a bunch of judges or Islamic legal scholars who ran their area according to their interpretation of customary Somalian plus Islamic law. Countries that are run more or less according to Sharia law, that is Islamic law, can sort of be described as critarchies as well, because the more solidly they adhere to strict Islamic law or interpretation of Islamic law, then the more influence and control judges will have, Islamic scholars and so on will have over the political power. But most countries that nowadays that are controlled, or even historically that are so-called under Sharia law, there's still a great deal of discretionary power or overall control by an elite or overarching government, imperial or nationalistic or whatever, or socialist sometimes, which is separate from the Islamic scholars. So in other words, just because a country says it's operating according to Sharia law doesn't mean it's a critarchy, because often that's not completely so. Next one I want to talk about is a diarchy, which is basically the same as a monarchy, except instead of having one ruler, you have two rulers, hence diarchy, ruled by two. Usually diarchs hold their position for life and pass the responsibilities onto their children or other family members when they die. So diarchy can be a stable political system in certain situations whereby you basically keep one monarch keep the state in check from the excesses or idiosyncrasies of a single ruler by having two rulers simultaneously. There are a number of examples of this. The Roman Republic was a diarchy because you had two consuls who had equal power and were in office simultaneously. Classical Sparta as well had two monarchs, so it was a diarchy, which were hereditary. A number of different medieval and early modern European states were dual monarchies, where basically you had, often it was the king and his queen at the same time were both the reigning monarchs at a given time. Perhaps one of the most common examples of this is Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. One was originally the queen of part of Spain, the other was Frederick was the king of the other part of Spain, and they married each other to unite Spain into a single kingdom. This is a common cause of dual monarchies or diarchies, particularly in early modern Europe, which was basically two already powerful monarchs marrying each other to unite their states into a single, more powerful entity. Modern Andorra and Swaziland is a small state in southern Africa, are also diarchies, so diarchy still does exist today. Relatively rare in history though, but still an interesting one to note. Next category of oligarchy I want to talk about is the single-party state. This is a relatively recent phenomenon, basically dating to the 19th century, late 19th century, but it was very popular during the early to mid 20th century and still exists today in a number of places. So a single party state is where a single political party forms a government and no other political parties are allowed to run candidates for election. So sometimes they still hold elections in single party states. They did this, for example, in the Soviet Union, but only the governing party is allowed to run candidates, and so you might have a ballot with only one candidate on it, which is not really much point. And other times they don't hold elections at all in single-party states. But the key thing about a single-party state is that often, especially if it's a true oligarchy, there's no single one all-powerful ruler who controls the government. Government is controlled by a small elite that exists within the political party, so a small top echelon of the political party, and they're associated, cadres and civil servants and so on. Sometimes small opposition parties or subsidiary coalition parties are permitted to exist, but they're of no particular significance to the actual governance of the country. 19th century Liberia is a small country in Africa, was perhaps the first example of a single party state because it was dominated by a single party for like 80 years or something like that. But there are lots of examples in the 20th century, including a lot of nationalist, fascist or socialist regimes. So, for example, Nazi Germany was a single party state, most communist countries are single party states. Italy under Mussolini is a single-party state. Many African and Latin American and Southeast Asian countries after independence were single-party states to various degrees. So a single-party state's a very broad category because you can also have dictatorships, which are single-party states, because you can have a dictator who establishes a political party to sort of augment or assist his rule. In this particular, the reason I've categorized the single-party state as an oligarchy is to highlight the states where they are not ruled by a single dictator, but are ruled by a political party, so a small elite at the top of the political party. A good example of this would be contemporary China, which is controlled by the Communist Party, but there's no single... they have a single headmost leader, but they're not completely in control, and they can be deposed or replaced. They're replaced every so often nowadays. Vietnam would be another example. So it's really the political party and a small elite within that control the state, not a single individual. So there are a few of those existing today. I mentioned Vietnam and China. There's also Turkmenistan, Syria, Laos, and Cuba are single-party states. Much more common nowadays, though, is the next and final subcategory of oligarchy, which I'll talk about, is the dominant party state. Obviously quite similar to a single-party state. Basically, a dominant party state is a nominally democratic country that has multiple political parties and regular elections. So in a dominant party state, you have to have multiple legal political parties, and they have to be regular elections. But they do not have to be fair elections, which is a key thing. So in a dominant party state, there are various laws or practices, so they could be de jure or de facto, which prevent the opposition parties from actually obtaining political power, actually exercising very much influence in the governance of the country. So the opposition parties still exist, they are still legal, and they're still, they can be significant in size, not like the tiny irrelevant ones that sometimes exist in a single party state. And they can sometimes get, a decent chunk of the votes, 20, 30%, but they'll never win the election. And they'll never exercise a significant amount of power. They can exercise a bit of power, they can introduce a bill in Parliament every now and again or whatever, but they never really get in control of the country. So dominant party state's a step towards democracy from a single party state, but it's still not a full representative democracy because it's not completely fair and free and so on. This is very common throughout the 20th century. It's still probably the most common form of government in the world today. As I said, most governments are now de jure, that is, by law, democracies, republics specifically, but in practice there's often a dominant political party. This is the form of government that exists in Russia nowadays, and so that's why Putin gets a lot of criticism even within Russia, because his party, I think it's United Russia, really dominates the political system, but there are still other political parties that get a fair number of votes, and perhaps soon elections, there'll be enough pressure so that the dominant party state actually becomes a real democracy. Many Latin American countries in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and also various African and Asian countries throughout the 20th century following their independence, were dominant party states where you had theoretical elections, but in practice one party dominated. The Kuomintang or Kuomintang, however you pronounce it, in Taiwan throughout most of the 20th century, up until a couple of decades ago, was a dominant party system. The People's Action Party in Singapore is a really good example of that, which still exists, which still governs Singapore today. So you have elections in Singapore, I think relatively fair actually, based on external observers, but still it's dominated by the People's Action Party. No other political parties that are completely taken seriously. The Revolutionary Institutional Party in Mexico, the name's not really that important, but Mexico was dominated by a single party for 60 years or so. Only around 2000 did another party win the election. And the Indian National Congress from 46 to 77 following independence, that was the party that was associated with Gandhi, and he was so influential that his party continued to win all elections and dominate the country until the late 70s. So, dominant party state is a very important category to be aware of. So, having now discussed oligarchies, I'll now move on to monarchies. Now, just a note, monarchies are generally classified as autocracies, because they're sort of self-derived power from a single individual, but they're, I think, distinct and important enough to warrant their own category of their own. So there are two basic forms of monarchy. There's an absolute monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. There's a third category I've put in here, which is sort of a transitional or a medium category between the two, which I've called enlightened absolutism, or also called enlightened despotism or an enlightened monarch. I'll talk about that in a second. But I'll start with an absolute monarchy. In an absolute monarchy, the monarch exercises ultimate governing authority as a head of the state and government. His or her powers are not limited by constitution or by law or by other parties. They really dominate the government and they can do whatever they like. Or almost whatever they like. They have a very large amount of power. It's basically like whatever the sovereign says, that goes. There's no constitution or other political parties or anything else limiting what they can do. In practice, there are always some limitations on power, but so this is sort of an abstraction, as most of these categories that I'm talking about are. Examples of this include Tsarist Russia before the revolution, Imperial China, once again before their revolution, the Roman Empire, many ancient and medieval kingdoms throughout the world, and so yeah, this is a very common form of government, especially in the ancient world. Pretty much the only form of government was the absolute monarchy. There are very few of these that still exist in the world today. Nepal, Tonga, and Bhutan, which are all relatively small states. Until recently, these were absolute monarchies. Recently, they've moved into a more democratic direction. Currently, there are only 4 absolute monarchies which still exist in the world. They are Brunei, Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. All of them are Muslim states. Brunei is near Malaysia. It's in Southeast Asia. Oman, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia are all in the Middle East. And they're all relatively small, except for Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is perhaps the best example of a current absolute monarchy. The royal family still controls that and has a very legendary power there, maintained by their oil revenues. All of these are also oil-rich states, which is why their absolute monarchs have been able to retain power and not been overthrown. So the next category that I want to talk about, enlightened absolutism or enlightened monarch, it's controversial whether this counts as a category because it's quite historically specific. It basically refers to an absolute monarch who has embraced the principles of the Enlightenment, and so emphasizes rationality and a sort of fair equal treatment of subjects and religious toleration, freedom of speech or a degree of freedom of speech, right to private property, fostering of the arts and education, and so on. So different leaders throughout history have been enlightened by this category of, fostering arts and industry and toleration and so on to various degrees. Some Roman emperors were like this, some Chinese rulers were like this. But specifically, the category of enlightened absolutism refers to a bunch of rulers in around 18th century Europe who embraced Enlightenment principles. But most of these kings and queens were in Prussia, France, Austria, Russia, and Sweden. There are specific monarchs that are associated with them. I won't go through their names, but this is an interesting category. It's often sort of conflated with a benign dictatorship, although it's not exactly the same thing. It's legal in absolute monarch who still has a lot of power, but they don't abuse their power, and particularly they have embraced toleration and other rationalist, enlightened principles. The final type of monarchy is the constitutional monarchy, which is sort of common in the world today. Well, there's a few of them. There used to be many more. The constitutional monarchy is where there is a monarch who is legally the head of state, but they act within the parameters of the constitution, be it a written or a customary constitution, so it doesn't have to be written down. Constitutional monarch does not have complete power. So sometimes they have some power, but often, increasingly nowadays, they really have no power at all. They only have formal powers, or they're a formality, they're a figurehead, basically. Historically, though, say in the 19th century or even 18th century, the constitutional monarchs did actually have power, say in Germany, during the German Empire, or the 19th century French empires as well, and the United Kingdom, say during the 18th century, as they were moving toward constitutional monarchy. The monarch did actually have some degree of power, but they didn't have complete power. They were constrained by Parliament and other figures that existed. Modern day Thailand, Malaysia, Spain, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the UK, and other Commonwealth countries are all constitutional monarchies. In addition to those, you've got the ex-Commonwealth countries, so basically that's Canada, Australia, New Zealand. South Africa used to be, but not anymore. Constitutional monarchy used to be more common, but in many cases it's been replaced by a republic. Okay, so the final category that I want to talk about is autocracies. And remember, monarchies can be classified as autocracies, but here I'm going to distinguish them and really put only the more extreme modern versions of autocracy in this category. So the first one I'll talk about is a theocracy, a term that's thrown around now and then. How you define a theocracy is a bit tricky, because if you ask a theocracy what a theocracy is, it's ruled by their god, or sometimes the officials who are divinely guided by their god.
if you ask someone who doesn't believe in that religion, or that particular type of religion, they'll say that a theocracy is just a state governed by some political party or perhaps a monarch who claims to be guided by God, or sometimes who claims to be a god themselves. So it depends who you ask about what a theocracy is, but basically it's a state that claims to be divinely guided, or perhaps to rule directly by God. It can often degenerate into a monarchy or dictatorship in practice when the whole religion thing's just used as a support to maintain legitimacy and power. There are quite a few examples of this throughout history, including ancient Israel, imperial cults, whereby the emperor or kings themselves were actually deified, sometimes during their life, sometimes after their death, and viewed as demigods and worshipped and sacrificed to and so on. So this occurred in many ancient kingdoms, but especially Rome and Egypt. Other examples of theocracies include the Caliphate in general, which was basically the Arab Muslim empire that existed in the around 8th to 10th centuries, or to 11th centuries, but especially the first version of that, which was the Rashidun Caliphate, which was perhaps the most religiously sincere, you might say, of the caliphates, and still considered legitimate by many modern Muslims, that existed around the 7th, 8th centuries. Calvinist Geneva and various Puritan settlements in the US could also be considered to some degree theocracies, because they were run by very staunchly religious leaders, according to their Puritan Calvinist ideologies. Early Utah as well, which was settled by Mormon pioneers, perhaps throughout most of the 19th century until it became a state and sort of more incorporated into the mainstream US, could have been considered as a theocracy because it was essentially run by the Mormon Church. Taliban Afghanistan as well could be considered a theocracy. As well, interestingly, the Central Tibetan Administration, which is the government in exile of Tibet. Many people don't think of this as a theocracy, but it's headed by the Dalai Lama, who is a religious leader and bases his philosophy and teachings and so on his religious beliefs. So to some degree it can be considered a theocracy. And the Vatican City, also obviously a theocracy, basically run by the Pope, and contemporary Iran, another example of a theocracy. So there are still a few around today. Okay, next category, military rule. This has been a relatively common occurrence in the 20th century especially, but it's existed all throughout history when a general takes over. Basically, military rule describes a number of related circumstances where political power resides with the military in various forms. Sometimes the military themselves can directly appoint themselves as governors of the country. Sometimes it occurs following a military coup, other times not. Sometimes it also just occurs when the military is not technically in control, but highly influential and highly have a very strong say in what happens in the government. A good example of that would be Japan during World War II. I don't think it was not technically a military rule, because you still had the emperor and a few other civilian people in the government, but the military was very influential and had a couple of positions on the cabinet and so on, so that would be a good example of a non-de jure but de facto military rule. England under Cromwell during the 17th century, during the English Revolution, is another example, because Cromwell was a military ruler. That's perhaps one of the first examples of a military rule in history which did not become a monarch, because usually earlier on, many times throughout history, a military ruler or general has taken over a state or whatever, but generally they'll pronounce themselves a prince or a king or something like that. Cromwell was one of the first cases, well, at least that I know of, that he didn't do that. He maintained a quasi-republican stance, I suppose, but was in practice military dictatorship. There are only a few existing military dictatorships or states that are under military rule at the moment, including Egypt, following the revolution there in relation to the Arab Spring. Fiji and the Maldives have also had recent military coups. Myanmar, also known as Burma, was a state under military rule for a long time, until I think around 2010-11, where the military's given up power, although once again the extent to which that's true in practice is questionable. In a state under military rule, it could be a military junta, spelled Junta, which is in control, which is like a committee of military officers governs the country, or it could be a single dictator is in control. So once again, it can be sort of an aristocracy, or a military rule state can be more of an oligarchy, or can be more of an autocracy sort of situation, depending on whether it's ruled by one or many. Okay, second last category, a dictatorship. This is when a single individual, the dictator, generally or unconstrained by law or constitutions or other political and social factors, dominates the state. So it's basically the same as a monarchy, except they don't crown themselves as a monarch and they don't claim that sense of legitimacy. I mean, it's basically the same except for title, really. It's more recent because in the past, if someone attained that degree of power, they would just call themselves a king or a prince or something. Around the 20th century, they tended not to do that and just call themselves dictators. Maybe they don't call themselves that, but that's effectively what they were. So this was very common in Europe throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Hitler, Mussolini, Franco in Spain, and many other countries were ruled by dictators. Kim Il-sung and his descendants in Korea are good examples of dictators. They very much dominated the state.
There are a couple of others who still exist today. Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya, who was recently overthrown, but he was a good example of a dictator. There's also Castro, who is sort of handed over power to his brother in Cuba, but he was a dictator for a long time. And many others in the third world, fascist and communist countries have also been dictators at various times throughout the 20th century. We'll talk more about fascism and communism in a second. And that dictatorship can be quite stable if the dictator is competent, but there are also obviously legitimacy issues there. Final category that I'll talk about, the subcategory of autocracy, is a totalitarian state. Now, this is a very modern phenomenon. It really only dates to the mid-20th century. A totalitarian state recognizes no limits to its authority at all and strives to regulate every aspect of private and public life wherever feasible or possible. So this is more than just a dictatorship. This is more than just where you have a very powerful government or a government that does not allow elections and so on. This is where the government goes just beyond that and tries to control every aspect of life. So generally you have state control of media, a single political party, constant all-encompassing propaganda, widespread political repression, a personality cult of the leader or pushing of their ideology through the propaganda, control over the economy as well, directing what they want to be achieved in that sense, severe restriction of speech, mass surveillance, widespread use of terror. It's called totalitarian because it's very totalistic. It's trying to control everything, not just maintain their political power. Basically, the only examples of totalitarian states are fascist and communist states. Few states have managed to really fully develop the totalitarian ideal that perhaps they aspired to, because it requires a great deal of power and wealth in a sense. That's why it's a 20th century phenomenon, because before that the state just lacked the capability technologically and economically to exercise that intensive degree of control over everything. And so a few states have been able to do it effectively. Perhaps some of the most effective totalitarian states would be Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and Communist China until they started to reform in the 1970s. Communist China is a good case because currently Communist China is not a dictatorship because it's not dominated by a single individual. It's still nominally communist, which means it still calls itself communist, but in practice it's moving away from that. In practice, I think it would be best to call it a single-party state because it's not a dominant party state because they don't hold fair elections, they don't call themselves a democracy, but it's controlled by a single political party, the Communist Party. Not a dictatorship because it's not dominated by a single individual, as I said. It's also no longer totalitarian because although it still does a lot of propaganda and still controls parts of the economy, it's no longer nearly as restrictive as free speech, or as all-encompassing in its propaganda, or as intensive in its control of the economy as it used to be under Mao in the 60s and 70s and so on. So China is a really good example of a state where this sort of classification can be useful because it's helpful to understand what it is and what it is not. There's no real totalitarian state that exists in the world today, except for North Korea. That's probably the only totalitarian state that currently exists. Cuba, maybe you could call it totalitarian, but it's not quite as much. Just to emphasize another distinction, a totalitarian regime doesn't have to be a dictatorship. It often is, because there's a personality cult associated with a single leader. It could be Stalin or Hitler or Mao or whoever. But it can also be a single-party state. So an example of this might be the Soviet Union after Lenin and Stalin. After that point, it was sort of moved away from dictatorship to becoming more of a single-party state ruled by a committee of the leading communists, not a single individual among them. But it was still totalitarian because there was still a lot of restriction of speech and domination of the economy and so on. So a totalitarian doesn't have to be a dictatorship, but often is. That's perhaps a good illustration of how these categories can overlap with each other, because you can have a military rule, which is also a dictatorship, which may or may not be totalitarian depending on how much it tries to influence society and so on. And theocracies are often also totalitarian to some degree, although in the case like Taliban, Afghanistan, they really lack the power to be properly totalitarian. Anyway, so that's all the categories I want to talk about in this episode. A bit longer than I expected, but there are quite a lot to go through. Hope you find this useful in sort of understanding the different ways that governments can be organised and in distinguishing different governments in history and in the present world from each other, and using labels sort of more precisely to be able to understand the nuanced interactions of power within and between countries. I'll be doing more political science episodes in the future. So until next time, goodbye.